Much of the British political class and media don't seem to want to touch the issue. Brexit, the elephant in the room ahead of the UK's upcoming elections. So let's take you through it. What is the state of Britain more than 4 years after leaving the EU? Polls suggest the British are fed up with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and his Conservative Tories' 14 years in power. Fixing the cost of living crisis and healthcare with the NHS are top priorities for voters. And what about Brexit campaigners' promise to reduce migration? The Labour Party's candidate Keir Starmer is promising change. This week, on To The Point, we ask, in a broken Britain, can a Labour government offer the UK a new start? Hello, I'm Claire Richardson. I'm thrilled to welcome our guest to our studio in Berlin. We have Nicolai von Ondarza, a political analyst at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Oliver Moody, Berlin correspondent for the British daily The Times. And Katja Hoyer, historian and author at King's College London, joining us today with The View from London. So, Katja, I think it makes sense to come straight to you. How would you describe the mood going into these elections on July 4th?
Well, there's certainly a lot of anger and disaffection out there, I think, not least with the fact that these problems, some of which were mentioned in the introductory film, have been around for years and decades, and there doesn't seem to be an attempt to sort of solve them as far as lots of people are concerned. Not everyone sees Labour as the obvious kind of way out of that. Many people vote Labour because they want change, but they're not entirely convinced that will come. So there's a general sense of, something needs to happen, something needs to change, and people aren't entirely sure kind of whether and how that's going to come forth. Yeah, so disagreement over how and whether that's going to change. But Oliver, do you think it's fair to say that most in the UK think that there is something fundamentally broken?
We can put numbers, really clear numbers on this. So a couple of days ago, there was a survey of people in 7 countries asking, how do you rate the general state of your country? And in Denmark, 25% said it was either quite or very bad. Sweden, it was 49%. Germany, it was 70%. But the absolute world champion was Britain, where 80% of the people felt that way. So there seems to be a very strong, very entrenched consensus that something has really fundamentally gone wrong.
Now, one of the biggest changes in the UK has, of course, been Brexit 4 years ago. Nicolai, why do you think this has not really been a topic in discussion in the media or among political elites, despite the fact that it has had such significant changes in the UK?
I think it's due to the political situation. About 60% of British now say that Brexit has been a mistake. So the Conservatives find it hard to campaign on Brexit because it has not been a success. Even the Brexit voters who are still for Brexit think it was handled badly. And then Labour is afraid of talking about Brexit because they want to re-win the Labour voters who went to the Conservatives in 2019, who still regard Brexit as an achievement. And so neither of the major party has an interest, at least at the moment, to make Brexit a core part of the campaign.
Now, for many watching, Oliver, given what we've just talked about, I think an international audience might be asking, OK, if Brexit hasn't gone as planned, if so many people are disillusioned with it, why wouldn't Labour, for example, then campaign on trying to get the UK back into the EU?
I think, in short, there are 2 reasons for that. The first is that public opinion is very divided. The surveys fluctuate a bit, but usually it looks like there's only 30 or 40% of the electorate that thinks it's a good idea to rejoin the EU, and they don't want to open up that whole can of worms and the polarisation that we had during the referendum yet. The second reason, I think, is that the actual policy differences you could make in Britain's relationship with the EU now are very technical, and the average person's understanding of and enthusiasm for these, what at the end of the day, rather kind of minor regulatory shifts, is a lot lower than it would have been 5 years ago.
All right, well, let's take a closer look at the repercussions of Brexit, especially with regard to the economy. That's a big one. An independent analysis published this year found that Brexit is costing the UK £140 billion. That's roughly 162 billion euros a year. The economy has shrunk. Many are feeling the consequences acutely in their everyday lives.
4 years after Brexit, British residents are feeling disillusioned. Many people are struggling with the sharp increase in the price of food and housing. Companies are complaining about staff shortages and border controls, along with rampant bureaucracy and delivery delays.
Britain has gone downhill since leaving the European Union. It's really gone downhill for everything.
The NHS, the country's healthcare system, has been especially impacted. Doctors are regularly striking against poor wages and staffing shortages.
It's probably very unfortunate for people who have missed appointments, but at the end of the day, if the staff aren't taken care of, then how can they take care of us?
7.5 million patients are currently waiting for treatment. The Brexiteers promised that billions of pounds would flow into the NHS instead of Brussels has not been fulfilled, which has led to approval ratings for Conservatives in power plummeting. This benefits the Labour Party, whose leader Keir Starmer is promising the British people change. But can Labour really change the country?
Let's come to Katja for more of a diagnosis of what's going on with the UK economy. Katja, how would you assess the state of the economy now in 2024 compared to before Brexit?
Well, when you look at what matters to people, the economy is always very high up, as is the cost of living, basically. And this is the main thing that people realize in their everyday lives, is that everything is just becoming so much more expensive. Even when you look at inflation rates just at surface level, that doesn't really translate into what this actually means for groceries, which has become disproportionately more expensive, the kind of day-to-day stuff really that matters to people. That's not entirely due to Brexit. I mean, there are obviously worldwide issues with inflation. COVID has a lot to do with that and other things as well. So sometimes it's just quite difficult to disentangle that, from the actual impact of Brexit. But one way or another, people are basically feeling the squeeze because it was already quite tight, even years ago for people to make ends meet at the end of the month. And now it's become impossible for many, many people across the country.
Yeah, Nicolai, how would you disentangle this? How much of this cost of living crisis and the state of the economy is down to Brexit versus things that are affecting the rest of Europe, like the coronavirus pandemic, like the war in Ukraine?
I think the big difference is that something like the pandemic, there was one huge hit to the economy and then it started to recover. And Brexit is a constant drag on the UK economy. It affects competitiveness, it affects how companies can trade with the EU. And therefore, economists estimate that the UK is losing about 4% of its GDP gradually over time. And this makes it so difficult for the UK to recover. And I think the second point, and this is maybe the difficulty for Brexiteers, many people in the UK now blame almost all problems economically on Brexit, whether it's true or not. And this has contributed to this effect of Brexit being so unpopular in the UK. Even as you say, inflation, cost of living crisis is something that also affects other European countries. But for the UK, Brexit comes on top of that and makes it even worse.
Yeah, Oliver, do you agree with that? And maybe you can also paint us a picture of what this cost of living crisis looks like for people who in the UK.
One huge factor that really doesn't have much at all to do with Brexit that we haven't talked about yet is the cost of housing, which is bad in a lot of Western countries, but is very particularly bad in Britain because of the tangle of regulations that prevent people from building, and also because of the mismanagement of fiscal policy under Liz Truss when she was Prime Minister. So the mortgage rates on my flat in London doubled in the space of 6 months. We were paying more than £1,000 a month more as a result of that particular economic crisis, which had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with Brexit.
So much unpredictability there for your average person. Katja, I guess the big question is that you hinted at already is, can Labour fix some of these issues that the Conservatives have not been able to?
Well, that is the big question. I mean, we don't really know, because the rhetoric that is coming out from the Labour Party at the moment actually sounds quite similar to what the Conservatives are saying. So there's a lot of talk about growth, economic growth, trying to basically create revenue, not necessarily directly through the raise of taxation, but to try and basically get the economy going and thereby increase the state's revenue. Whether that will come to pass, of course, entirely depends on whether they can create that growth that they need to make that work. If not, then they may either have to borrow money or raise taxes, both of which will, of course, have an impact on the economy overall.
Yeah, Nicolai, I'd like to get your view on that too, whether Labour has a plan in place that could do what the Conservatives have not. And also what Katja mentioned, I think, is important about how are you going to pay for all this?
Yeah. So Labour has a huge lead in the polls, around 20%. And so they're almost guaranteed to have a government with a probably very, very large absolute majority. And you could guess that would give them the breathing space to be more innovative and give out more radical ideas. But Keir Starmer has used the very opposite strategy. In London, they speak about a Ming-Va strategy, where he holds this poll lead beforehand and is very cautious to say anything that might upset voters. And so he rules out any tax increases. He's very cautious on Brexit. And so, as Katja said, the economic ideas in the Labour manifesto basically boil down to, we hope we can stimulate more growth by being a more competent government, but we will not say anything how we actually address the fiscal problems. And this will become a huge difficulty once Labour has this majority. And basically on day one, he will have to give the answers to the economy, to the people, on how he will address this very, very tight fiscal space and still achieve growth for the UK.
And until then, he's shuffling toward voting day, holding this really delicate vase in his hands. Oliver, I do want to talk about the NHS. This is also one of the things that when polled, the British say they really want to see an improvement to from the next government. Ahead of Brexit, Boris Johnson had promised that leaving the EU would free up money that would then be reinvested in Britain's health service. Why has that not happened?
Why has it not happened? Because the money wasn't freed up by leaving the EU. But it's also not entirely true that the government hasn't invested in the health service. Health spending has risen. And in fact, in international comparison, we spend about 11.3% of our GDP on the health service, which is not as high as here in Germany, but it's very high by the standards of rich countries. So I think you have to ask, really, what are the kind of underlying reasons why we're getting such poor results for what is a fairly significant investment?
All right, so as we've heard, anger has been largely directed at the ruling Conservative Party, but I think it's important to talk about something else. Giving them a run for their money in the polls is a right-wing populist party featuring many of the same faces and names you might know from UKIP, which campaigned in favour of Brexit.
Well, guess who's back?
Mr. Brexit Nigel Farage has returned. He's trying to enter the House of Commons with his new party, Reform UK. According to a poll, it's the second strongest party behind Labour and ahead of the Tories. Farage insists the Conservatives have failed to deliver on the promises made during Brexit, including limits on immigration.
The only way to really fully restore sovereignty, to decide who can come in, who can stay, is by leaving that European Court of Human Rights. It is completely out of date.
This populist terminology is similar to PM Sunak's recent statements.
Our domestic courts will no longer be able to use any domestic or international law, including the Human Rights Act, to stop us removing illegal migrants.
Sunak aims to deport refugees to Rwanda. Although courts had ruled that it's dangerous, Sunak's government responded saying Rwanda is safe. Now Farage is once again fishing for right-wing votes. His goal is to become Prime Minister in 5 years. Right-wing populism and immigration, will they shape British politics even more in the future?
So, Nicolai, it seems that the only politicians in the UK still openly supporting Brexit are part of Reform UK. Can you put this party into perspective for us? For example, how does it compare to other right-wing populist movements that we've seen in Western Europe?
So Reform UK is very similar to other far-right national conservative parties, I would say. They campaign, for instance, for very strict migration rules. They campaign against net zero climate policy. And I think the biggest similarity is that their main aim is really to take over the centre-right position. So Farage's stated aim is basically to become second in the polls, maybe not even get many seats in the House of Commons, but intellectually take over the Conservative Party and drive it further to the far right and establish this as the only opposition to Labour. And then this would give him the space to implement or push for his policies that he wants to get in the long term.
In this election, Oliver, would you have expected to see Reform UK performing so well relative to the Conservative Party?
I absolutely would. Look, I grew up in a rural family of dyed-in-the-wool Conservatives who regarded Margaret Thatcher as a saint and David Cameron as a dangerously wet Liberal. And what I find interesting looking back is that they voted for previous Nigel Farage projects, for the UK Independence Party, for the Brexit Party, without feeling that they compromised their identity as Tories, because they saw Nigel Farage as an instrument to drag their own party towards what they saw as more authentic Conservative values. In other words, this has always been about moving the main centre-right party in Britain to the right, first of all on the EU, then on net zero, and now increasingly on immigration and Russia.
And Katja, do you think then that we will see a bigger role of this brand of right-wing populism in the UK? Have they been successful in what Oliver is laying out?
I think so, not least because they have Nigel Farage back. You know, the problem that many people have with the two mainstream parties is that they haven't got any personnel really at the top with any form of, what you might describe as charisma, and Nigel Farage does have that. And so I think, because they've managed to sort of drag him out of retirement or whatever it is that he was doing, they have now got somebody who's basically able to galvanize a section of the population behind him, and that will play a role.
Now, a lot of this is true not just in the UK, but in a lot of right-wing movements within Europe. One thing that came up again and again is immigration in the UK, reducing it, tightening borders. In fact, one of the biggest promises of Brexit, right, was that if the UK left the EU, it would be able to tighten borders. Nicolai, do you think that promise after Brexit has been fulfilled?
Yes and no. I mean, the ironic thing is that the Brexit referendum was about migration from the EU, and that actually went down. A lot of less people from the EU come to the UK, and many people from the EU have left. But what has risen is illegal migration into the UK to a very, very strong extent, but also migration from other parts of the world like Hong Kong, Pakistan, India, that has also risen. And so right now, the net migration of the UK has reached figures that were never reached before the Brexit referendum, over 600,000 people per year. And that means for many Brexiteers who wanted to vote for Brexit to really control the borders, the exact opposite has happened. We have the small boat crisis, and even the Conservative Party, with all the Rwanda policy that Rishi Sunak tried to implement, has not managed to really control the border. And this is one of the core reasons why the attack from the far right is so open, with Nigel Farage, but also people within the Conservative Party attacking Rishi Sunak and saying we have not really fulfilled our core problem of controlling migration and controlling our own borders.
And Oliver, what is Labour promising here regarding migration?
First of all, I hate to contradict Nicolai with his considerable expertise, but while the political focus is very much on irregular immigration, the increase that we've seen in immigration from outside the EU has overwhelmingly been regular Labour migration to fill unfilled jobs, above all in the care sector and in the health sector. And
areas that are really lacking in the
even
UK.
the Reform Party, in its manifesto, that is the right-wing populist party, admits that it would only try and curb non-necessary immigration, right? Because there is actually a kind of silent political consensus that our economy can only be sustained, that we can only pay for people to look after our elderly mothers or to sustain the NHS with a certain level of immigration, not even of skilled labour, but also of unskilled labour.
Does that play into Labour's platform this time around?
I don't think Labour has taken any kind of very particularly strong positions on the subject. Are you?
They've said that they want to shelve the Rwanda policy and that their aim is to get illegal migration under control by sort of tackling the criminal gangs rather than trying to establish this deterrent of the Rwanda policy. But they're also, I think, back again to this Ming-Va strategy, very, very careful not to talk about immigration, because that is one of the attack lines of the Conservatives, saying if you get Labour, you will get much more people to the UK. There was a very nasty advert by the Conservative Party where they showed somebody from Labour rolling out a red carpet at the British coast and saying, if you vote Labour, you will get lots of more illegal immigration. So they're very careful not to talk about that, even if, as you said, legal migration is actually increasing and helpful for the UK.
Because the numbers here are tiny, right?
Yeah.
The Rwanda scheme, we're talking about maybe a few hundred people at most being deported each year. The obsession with the so-called small boats, smugglers bringing people across the channel, that's 30,000 a year. Like, that's not even 5% of the total. And so I think the political debate about this has been incredibly narrow in comparison to the kind of overall demographic changes we're seeing.
So just to be clear, why make such a big deal out of this if it's a relatively small number of people coming?
So my theory here is that in the Brexit referendum and since then, it's not fundamentally for most voters been about the number of people coming into the UK. It has been about the feeling that they can exercise some form of control over who comes in. And what becomes very visible with irregular immigration, in particular with the small boats, is the fact that we can't control this.
Yeah. Katja, I'd just like to bring you in here too and get your thoughts on what Nicolai and Oliver have been talking about. Do you share that same view?
Well, I think it genuinely is a big issue for a lot of voters. So you see when you look at surveys that around 2/3 of voters consider immigration one of the big things that sort of keeps them awake at night. And that's been pretty stable actually for a few years now. So it is a big issue, which is why the Tories are keen to talk about it. But what they're not keen to talk about is effectively the dependence of the British economy on cheap kind of ready-made labour, people who've already been trained to do certain things, particularly in the medical sector, and can then be sort of imported, if you will, into the UK without the UK, industry having or the economy having to train them themselves. And so this focus on the small boats is a way about taking, immigration as a topic and talking about it, but not about the bit that they don't really want to do anything about. So you can still use this topic without really addressing why legal migration is still so high.
Nicolai, I just want to bring this full circle and get some final thoughts on what's ahead after these elections. Can Labour be a new start for the UK? This is our big question.
So I think first, new governments are in pretty quickly in the UK. So basically the day after the elections, if Labour gets a huge majority, Keir Starmer will be invited to form the government. But it will not be a Blair-style 1997 revolution where Labour comes in with a plan to really turn the country around. I think the best line I would describe Labour's current policy is we want to do a lot of things like the Tories, but we want to do them more competent. And then Keir Starmer will try to very carefully readjust some of the levers of the UK public policy, address these fiscal circumstances. I don't think foreign policy will be a big issue. So even the UK-EU relationship, which we talked about in the beginning, Labour will only very carefully address that. And really the focus will be on tackling NHS, the cost of living crisis, with a sort of small levers, and Labour trying to convince the economy to invest more in the country. And this is what I think Starmer will say on day one after the elections.
And where does this leave the Conservatives then? Assuming Labour does roll to victory as the polls are showing, what do you expect to come next in the reckoning after?
This is actually a super interesting and unpredictable question, I think, because the general default assumption is that they will draw the lesson from their defeat, that they weren't far enough to the right and that's why they hemorrhaged so many votes to the right-wing populists, rather than concluding that they lost it in the middle and they should have tried to fight Labour for the centre ground, and that therefore it would get increasingly radical. You would have a right-wing leader, somebody like Suella Braverman or Priti Patel, who are the former Home Secretaries. But there are also analyses that suggest the complexion of the parliamentary party could actually be pretty centrist after the election. It could be like radically different to what we've been used to for the past 5 years, in which case, it is very possible that they could recognise quite quickly that the only plausible route they've got back to power is to appoint somebody who can try and win the battle for the centre ground.
It would be interesting to see how that plays out. Katja, let's come to you. is the UK, do you think, if you had to look into your crystal ball and make a prediction, what's happening next year in the UK? Will it see change, as Keir Starmer is promising? Or does Brexit have a role in fundamentally crippling it in what it sees in the years ahead in terms of its economy and its standing on the world stage?
I don't think Brexit will necessarily play a huge role. I think Keir Starmer has already said, that obviously he doesn't want to take the UK back in. He will try and tweak basically the existing agreements, be that on security or on imports, exports, and so on. But it will be incremental change. So not. I don't think that the big thing that will dominate the headlines. I think for me an interesting question is what's happening internally with the Labour Party. I mean, this kind of Ming Vase approach that we've been talking about has also worked, towards the inside really of the Labour Party, because that's very divided, and whether Keir Starmer can bring that together, the left and the right wing kind of wings of it, and then run the country with them remains to be seen.
All right, so a political reckoning for both sides, it sounds like. We'll keep an eye on the election results as they come out. I want to thank my fabulous panel of guests for your insights today. It's Nicolai von Ondarza, Oliver Moody, and Katja Hoyer. And to you watching at home, thank you so much for your attention. If you're watching on YouTube, drop us a comment in the comments section. I'm Claire Richardson in Berlin, and we're so glad you could join us today.